Hello and welcome to this lecture on short-term factors influencing voting behaviour. The last lecture looked at long-term factors, also known as primacy factors, influencing voting behaviour. These are aspects of people's identity, such as class, the region they're from, ethnicity, gender and age, that can have an impact on their party, long-term party affiliation. These are considered long-term factors because they don't tend to change much over time, or in the case of age, change only very slowly. In this lecture, we'll be discussing the short-term factors that can affect voting behaviour, the things that can influence the way people vote from one election to the next. So just pause the video here and note down, just off the top of your head, what short-term factors you can think of, what might change people's minds about who to vote for from one election to the next. Okay, done that? So we will be talking in this lecture about things like the party's policies and manifesto pledges, the party leaders, the party's election campaigns, and the role of the media. And all of these things can affect which way people vote. I think what I'm going to do, because I wrote this as one lecture, but it's quite long, so I think I'm going to try and do this as 4 separate videos, one on each factor, but you should watch all of them really as one lecture, but you don't have to watch them all at once. Okay, before we start, it's worth noting that as class de-alignment and subsequently partisan de-alignment have proceeded, eroding therefore people's long-term attachment to a particular party, these short-term or recency factors have become more important, as more and more people are effectively swing voters, not attached to any particular party, and therefore more susceptible to the influence of the short-term factors we will discuss. For example, at least 60% of voters are thought to have voted for at least 2 different parties across the 4 general elections in the UK between 2005 and 2017. So this means that swing voters, who were once considered a small minority of voters, now comprise the majority of the electorate. And this has led to an increase in what is called electoral volatility, in which voting behaviour can change wildly from one election to the next. And this in turn means that short-term factors are becoming more and more important, as people's voting patterns can no longer be taken for granted based on long-term identities, such as class or region. Now, these short-term factors are also termed recency factors, and recency theorists believe them to be of the most importance in determining voting behaviour. So, during this lecture, I'm going to go through the influence of each of these recency factors in turn. For each of them, I'm going to give a broad overview of the significance of the factor, which I suggest you definitely take notes on. But then, for each factor, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into those factors, into some of the theories around them, and particularly into how they played out in the 2019 election in particular. And this second part of each section, I'll leave it up to you to decide if you want to take notes or not, depending how much detail you want to get down. What I'd suggest, thinking about exams and so on, if you're aiming for A or A star grade, you should probably take notes on the whole thing. If you're aiming for a B or C, then probably just the first half of each section, the basic overview, will probably be enough. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so first of all, policies can play a role in shaping voting behaviour. That is both the policies actually implemented by the governing party whilst they're in power, and the policies promised by each party in their manifestos. Now, rational choice theorists believe that it is policies which are the fundamental determinant of voting behaviour, the most important factor. Now just pause the video here and remind yourself, what is rational choice theory? Okay, did you do it? So, rational choice theory is a theory of voting behaviour that assumes that voters make a rational, that is a logical judgment on who to vote for based on what is in their own best interests. In other words, they will vote for the party whose policies will be best for them personally, the party that will benefit them the most and cost them the least, usually based on the economic policies of each party. So, as I said, voters will make a judgment both on the policies actually implemented by the governing party and on the policies promised in each party's manifesto. So let's take each of these in turn. One way of viewing elections is essentially almost as referendums on the governing party's performance. In other words, each general election can be considered a referendum in which the question is, are you happy with the current government's performance? If your answer is yes, you'll vote for the governing party. If your answer is no, you'll vote for one of the opposition parties. So elections can be seen as a judgment on the governing party's policies. Thatcher's election victory in 1983, for example, was widely seen as an endorsement of her policy of war against Argentina to retake the Falkland Islands the previous year. Her personal approval ratings almost doubled after the Falklands War, from 36% to 59%, and she won the election comfortably. 4 years later, in 1987, when she led the Conservatives to their third election victory in a row, the result was viewed by many as an indication of the electorate's endorsement of the policies she had implemented over the previous 8 years, such as cracking down on trade unions, privatising state-owned industry and deregulating the economy. In contrast, the 1997 election, which brought 18 years of Conservative rule to an end, was seen as a rejection of the policies which had been followed, and in particular as punishment by the electorate for the failed economic policies which came to a head in Black Wednesday in 1992, in which Britain was forced out of the European exchange rate mechanism after having spent billions of pounds trying to prevent this outcome. So if we see elections in this way as a referendum on the government's performance, then clearly it is policies, and in particular the governing party's policies, which are the key factor in determining voting behaviour and election outcomes. However, it is not only the policies which have already been implemented which can affect voting behaviour, it's also those which are being promised. So pause the video here and remind yourself of the name of the document in which each party lists the policies they'll follow if they're elected. That's right, the manifesto. So voters may also be voting according to which manifesto they prefer, which set of policies on offer they prefer. Famously, Labour's 1983 election manifesto was referred to as, quote, the longest suicide note in history, as it contained various policies which were thought anathema to voters, reversing Thatcher's reforms, placing huge amounts of industry under state control and giving up nuclear weapons. Roy Hattersley, who later became Deputy Labour leader, said of his campaigning on the doorstep in the 1983 election campaign that working class voters who had voted Labour all their lives were telling him they could not do so this time due to the party's manifesto commitment to unilateral nuclear disarmament. In 1997, Labour's 5 key policy pledges carefully combined traditional left-wing promises to cut class sizes, reduce NHS waiting lists, and get 250,000 unemployed young people into work, whilst at the same time reassuring voters that they'll be tough on crime and would not increase taxes. These policies proved very popular with the electorate and were seen by many as key to overcoming their reputation as a party of high taxes, and were thus a major driver of their landslide election victory of that year. The 2019 election, in contrast, was viewed by many as a repeat of 1983, with Labour offering the same reversal of Thatcherism, based on big public spending pledges and the renationalisation of huge swathes of the economy. According to those on the right of the party, it was this left-wing policy package which cost Labour the election. Now, before I go on, I want to warn you, as I said, the rest of this section on policy is a bit more detailed, and I would suggest notes on the next section is optional. If you feel you're getting overwhelmed, don't worry, you have the basic points already based on what I've just said, so consider note-taking on this next section as optional. So, I just want to take a moment here to compare the 2017 and 2019 manifesto pledges of the two main parties on what have arguably been the two major issues dominating politics in the last few years. So just pause the video here and think, what do you think are the two main issues that have dominated UK politics in recent years, at least up until COVID hit? Okay, did you do it? Well, I would suggest the two main issues dominating UK politics in recent years have been Brexit, probably you agree with me on that, and austerity, that is cuts to public spending, cuts to public services, which the Conservatives have been implementing since they came to power in 2010. Now, remember that the Labour Party did surprisingly well in the 2017 election, increasing their vote share from 30% to 40%, the highest increase in the Labour vote since World War II, and just 2% behind the Conservatives. Now, in the 2017 election, the two main parties had almost identical policies on Brexit, that they would respect the referendum result and leave the EU, as well as leaving the single market and the customs union. But on the other main issue of the day, austerity, there was a clear difference. Labour promised to stop the cuts, whereas the Conservatives promised to continue them, even suggesting things like a reduction in pension increases, reductions to winter fuel payments, and ending free school meals to infants. It's seen as very cruel, attacks on the very young and the elderly and so on. And in polling conducted by Lord Ashcroft, famous Conservative Party pollster, conducts opinion polls for the Conservatives, it was revealed that one of the most popular policies offered by Labour in 2017 had been their pledge to scrap the public sector pay freeze, which was effectively cutting real wages of nurses, teachers, firefighters, police and all other public servants year on year. The Conservatives, meanwhile, pledged to continue the public sector pay freeze. In other words, in 2017, the electorate faced two parties, both offering to get Brexit done, but only one, Labour, offering to end austerity. And the Conservatives' failure to recognise how unpopular the spending cuts have become, combined with Labour's recognition of the importance of respecting the Brexit referendum result, combined, I would argue, to lose the Conservatives their parliamentary majority. Fast forward to 2019, and the Conservatives had learned these lessons well, whilst Labour, it seemed, had forgotten them. Boris Johnson now pledged to end austerity, including scrapping the unpopular public sector pay freeze in particular, whilst Labour now suggested a second referendum on the EU with the possibility of overturning Brexit altogether. So now the electorate faced two parties who both pledged to end austerity, but only one promising to unequivocally get Brexit done. And arguably it was this policy package of delivering Brexit and ending austerity that won the Conservatives the election. However, there is some interesting evidence from the 2019 election which undermines the traditional rational choice theory that voters simply vote for whichever party offers the policies that best suit their interests. According to rational choice theory, voters in classes D and E should have been much more likely to vote Labour than voters in classes A and B. Labour's manifesto promised to raise taxes on those with incomes over £85,000 in order, in part, to increase benefits and the minimum wage. That is, people to increase benefits, in other words, for people on classes D and E. So this is clearly a policy that will benefit D and E voters at the expense of A and B voters. Yet D and E voters in 2019 were more likely to vote Conservative than Labour, and Labour actually received more votes amongst classes A and B than it did amongst Ds and Es. A variation of rational choice theory, called the Valence Model, V-A-L-E-N-C-E, has an explanation for this. The Valence Model suggests that it's not those parties whose policies most closely match the interests and preferences of voters who win the most votes, but rather those parties who are deemed most capable of delivering those policies. So opinion polls in 2019 repeatedly found that whilst Labour's economic policies were individually popular with voters, when they were presented as a package, or when they were associated with Labour, they were much less popular. This is likely because voters felt that the policy programme as a whole was too ambitious and that Labour was not capable of delivering it. They liked Labour's policies, they just didn't believe Labour could deliver them, and certainly not all of them at once. So clearly, whilst policies are important in determining voting behaviour, perhaps even more important is believability. Do people trust the party to deliver these policies? And this in turn is often influenced by perceptions of the party's leadership. So it's to leadership that we will turn in the next video.